Do you take this woman to be your wife?
I do.
You may now kiss the bride.
Subscribe to Wild West Soul Stories. Hit the bell, like, comment, and share. Thanks for watching. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning when the Wyoming wind carried the scent of wildflowers across the prairie. Eliza May Thornton held the weathered envelope in her trembling hands, her heart beating faster than the hooves of a runaway stallion. Inside was a response to her desperate advertisement, one she had placed in the eastern newspapers 3 months prior, when loneliness and desperation had finally broken through her stubborn pride. She was 32 years old, widowed for 3 years, and the ranch that her late husband Thomas had built with his bare hands was slowly dying around her. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed mending, and her spirit needed something she could not quite name. She had written the advertisement with shaking hands late one autumn night, asking not for a worker, but for a husband, someone who would share both her burdens and her bed, someone who would make the silence of the empty farmhouse less suffocating. The letter was brief and written in careful, deliberate penmanship. The man's name was Samuel Rivers, and he was 35 years old from Pennsylvania. He had worked in his father's carpentry shop for most of his life before a terrible accident had claimed both his parents. He had no family left, no ties to bind him to the east, and he was willing to travel west to become her husband. There was only one condition, one truth he felt she deserved to know before making her decision. He could not speak. A fever in childhood had stolen his voice, leaving him silent for nearly 30 years. He could hear perfectly well, could read and write with elegant precision, but no words would ever pass his lips. Eliza read the letter 7 times before the sun set that evening. She thought of the whispered gossips in town, the pitying glances from the other women, the knowing smirks from men who assumed a widow alone was fair game for their unwanted advances. She thought of the empty chair across from hers at the dinner table, the cold side of the bed that never warmed, the conversations she held with the wind because there was no one else to hear her thoughts. She picked up her pen and wrote back that same night, telling Samuel Rivers that she did not need his words. She needed his presence, his help, his willingness to try. 3 weeks later, she found herself standing on the wooden platform of the small train station, clutching his letter against her chest like a talisman. The man who stepped off the train was taller than she had imagined, broad-shouldered with hands that spoke of years of honest labor. His hair was the color of chestnuts, and his eyes were a deep gray that reminded her of storm clouds gathering over the mountains. He wore simple clothes, carried a single leather bag, and when his gaze found hers across the crowded platform, something shifted in the air between them. He walked toward her with purpose, and when he stopped before her, he did not attempt to speak. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a small folded paper. She opened it to find a single sentence written in his careful hand. "I am Samuel. I am honored to meet you, Eliza." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Samuel sat beside her on the wagon seat, his eyes taking in the vast expanse of prairie grass, the distant purple mountains, the endless sky that stretched above them like a blessing. When they arrived at the farmhouse, he stepped down first and offered her his hand. His palm was warm and calloused, and when she placed her fingers in his, she felt a steadiness that had been missing from her life for far too long. They were married by the town preacher that very afternoon, standing in the small church with only the reverend's wife as witness. When it came time for Samuel to say his vows, he simply placed his hand over his heart and looked at Eliza with such sincerity that her eyes filled with unexpected tears. The first weeks were an adjustment for them both. Eliza was accustomed to filling silence with chatter, and she found herself talking more than she ever had before, telling Samuel about the ranch, about Thomas, about her childhood in Missouri, about her dreams and fears and everything in between. Samuel listened with an attention that made her feel truly heard for the first time in her life. He would nod at the right moments, shake his head in sympathy, and sometimes reach out to squeeze her hand when her words grew heavy with old grief. When he needed to communicate something complex, he would write notes on the small pad of paper he kept always in his shirt pocket. His messages were thoughtful and sometimes unexpectedly humorous, and Eliza found herself looking forward to reading each one. Samuel threw himself into the work of the ranch with a dedication that left Eliza breathless. He rose before dawn and did not rest until the stars appeared overhead. He mended fences that had been broken for years, repaired the barn roof that leaked with every rainfall, and built a beautiful new chicken coop that the hens took to immediately. His carpentry skills transformed the tired farmhouse into something warm and welcoming. He carved new chairs for the kitchen table, installed shelves in the pantry, and one evening presented Eliza with a delicate wooden jewelry box he had made from scraps of oak, sanded smooth as silk and polished until it glowed. The gift made her cry. She sat at the table with the box cradled in her hands, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, and she could not explain to him that no one had ever made her something so beautiful, so thoughtful, so clearly crafted with care. Thomas had been a practical man, kind in his way but not given to sentiment or romance. The jewelry box was the first gift she had received in years that existed purely to bring her joy, and the fact that it came from a man who had known her for barely a month made her heart ache in ways she did not fully understand. Samuel watched her cry with worry creasing his brow. He pulled out his paper and wrote quickly, asking if he had done something wrong. Eliza shook her head and reached across the table to take his hand. She told him it was perfect, that he was perfect, that she had never felt so seen in her entire life. His gray eyes softened, and he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles. It was the first time he had kissed her, and the tenderness of the gesture made her breath catch in her throat. Their relationship deepened as the seasons changed. Summer faded into autumn, and the ranch flourished under Samuel's tireless care. He had a gift with animals, a calm patience that made even the most skittish horses trust him completely. Eliza watched him work from the kitchen window, marveling at how he communicated with the livestock through touch and gesture, never needing words to make himself understood. She began to realize that words were not the only way to speak, that language existed in the brush of a hand against a cheek, in the way coffee appeared at her elbow before she even asked, in the wild roses he picked from the meadow and left beside her pillow. The first time she truly understood the depth of Samuel's love came on a bitter October night when fever gripped her body without warning. She had been pushing herself too hard, trying to match his tireless work ethic, and her body had finally rebelled. She collapsed in the kitchen, shaking with chills despite the fire blazing in the hearth, and Samuel found her there when he came in from the barn. The fear in his eyes was something she would never forget. He gathered her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her to their bedroom, laying her gently on the bed before rushing to fetch cool water and clean cloths. For 3 days and 3 nights, Samuel did not sleep. He sat beside her bed, bathing her forehead with cool water, spooning broth between her cracked lips, holding her hand through the worst of the tremors. When the fever dreams came and she cried out for her mother, long dead these 20 years, he climbed into the bed beside her and held her against his chest, letting his heartbeat anchor her to the world. She remembered fragments through the haze of illness, the feel of his arms around her, the warmth of his body against hers, the absolute safety she felt in his embrace. When the fever finally broke on the 4th morning, Eliza opened her eyes to find Samuel slumped in the chair beside the bed, exhausted beyond measure, his face pale and drawn from days without rest. She reached out with a weak hand and touched his cheek, and he startled awake immediately, his gray eyes searching her face with desperate hope. When he saw that she was lucid, that the fever had passed, his face crumpled with relief. He dropped to his knees beside the bed and pressed his forehead against her hand, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had never seen a man weep before, not like this, with such raw and overwhelming emotion, and she realized in that moment that she loved him, not out of gratitude or convenience or desperation, but with a fierce and tender love that took her breath away. Recovery took time, but Samuel never left her side. He brought her meals in bed, read to her from the worn books on her shelf, and sat with her in comfortable silence as she regained her strength. One afternoon, as she sat propped against the pillows watching him mend a tear in her favorite dress, she told him she loved him. The words came out before she could stop them, simple and true and terrifying. Samuel's hands stilled on the fabric, and he looked up at her with such wonder that she felt tears pricking her eyes again. He set aside the sewing and crossed to the bed, kneeling beside her as he had on the morning her fever broke. He pulled out his paper and wrote 3 words that she would keep pressed inside her Bible for the rest of her life. My heart is yours. Winter came harsh and early. At year, blanketing the prairie in snow that reached past the windowsills, but inside the farmhouse, warmth filled every corner. Eliza and Samuel fell into an easy rhythm of domestic life, cooking together, caring for the animals together, sitting by the fire together in the evenings while the wind howled outside. He had built her a rocking chair for Christmas, carved with wildflowers along the arms, and she had knitted him a scarf in deep blue wool that matched the Montana sky at twilight. They exchanged their gifts on Christmas morning, and then Samuel surprised her with something more precious than any object could ever be. He'd been practicing, she realized, watching his face contort with effort as he struggled to push sound past his silent throat. What emerged was broken and strange, barely recognizable as language, but she understood the word immediately. Her name, Eliza. He said it only once, and the effort cost him greatly, leaving him breathless and trembling, but the triumph in his eyes was unmistakable. He had given her the only word he would ever speak, and she knew he would never speak another. She threw her arms around his neck and wept against his shoulder, overwhelmed by the magnitude of such a gift. He had fought against the silence of 30 years to give her this single word, her name on his lips, proof that she had become important enough to break through every barrier. Spring arrived with a gentleness that felt like forgiveness. The snow melted, the prairie erupted in wildflowers, and Eliza discovered that she was carrying Samuel's child. She told him the news one evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and she watched. His face transform from confusion to disbelief, to a joy so pure it seemed to light him from within. He dropped to his knees before her and pressed his ear against her still flat belly, and when he looked up at her, his gray eyes were bright with tears. That night he held her so tenderly she felt like something precious, something cherished, something worth protecting with every ounce of his being. The townspeople had whispered when Eliza first brought home her silent husband. They had wondered about her judgment, questioned her sanity, predicted disaster before the first frost. But now those same people watched Samuel Rivers with grudging respect. They saw how he treated his wife like a queen, how he worked harder than any man in the territory, how he had transformed a struggling Thornton ranch into something thriving and beautiful. The women especially noticed how Eliza had changed, how she laughed more often now, how her eyes sparkled with a happiness she had never possessed before, how she moved through the world like a woman who knew she was deeply and completely loved. Love, Eliza learned, did not require words. Love was Samuel rising before dawn to start the coffee so she could sleep a little longer. Love was the way he always walked on the outside of the sidewalk when they went to town, placing himself between her and any danger. Love was the flowers he picked, the chairs he built, the way he brushed her hair each night with such gentle reverence that she felt like a goddess in his hands. Love was his silent laughter, shoulders shaking and eyes crinkling, when she told him something amusing. Love was the way he held her in the darkness, his heartbeat steady a guy, nursed her back, his arms wrapped around her as if he would never let go. Their daughter was born on a perfect August afternoon when the sunflowers stood tall in the fields and the sky stretched endless and blue above them. Samuel paced outside the bedroom door while the midwife attended to Eliza, and when the baby's first cry split the air, he burst through the door with tears already streaming down his cheeks. The midwife placed the tiny bundle in his arms, and Eliza watched her silent husband fall completely in love with their daughter. He looked at the baby, then at her, then back at the baby, and his face held more words than his voice could ever have spoken. Gratitude and wonder and fear and love, all tangled together in an expression she would remember until her dying day. They named her Rose for the wild roses Samuel picked each summer morning, and she grew up knowing a father's love in its purest form. Samuel could not sing lullabies, but he hummed melodies that vibrated in his chest as he rocked her to sleep. He could not read stories aloud, but he acted them out with such dramatic flair that Rose giggled until she hiccuped. He could not speak the words "I love you," but Rose never once doubted that she was adored. She learned to read her father's eyes, to understand his gestures, to appreciate that some conversations happened without sound. Years passed like water through a sieve, precious and uncatchable. Eliza's hair silvered at the temples, Samuel's broad shoulders gained a slight stoop, and Rose grew into a beautiful young woman who eventually married a kind rancher from the neighboring county. The farmhouse grew quieter again, but never empty, never lone. Eliza and Samuel sat on the porch in matching rocking chairs each evening, watching the sun set over the prairie they had tended together for decades. Sometimes she talked, telling him stories he had heard 100 times before. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, holding hands across the space between their chairs, content in the simple presence of each other. On their 40th wedding anniversary, Samuel led Eliza to the meadow where the wild roses grew thickest. He had packed a picnic basket and spread a blanket on the soft grass, and they ate bread and cheese and drank elderflower wine as the butterflies danced around them. Afterward, he pulled out his worn paper and wrote her a letter, longer than anything he had ever written before. He told her that marrying her was the best decision he had ever made. He told her that she had given him a home when he had none, a family when he was alone, a purpose when he was lost. He told her that every silent day of his life had been leading him to her, and that he would choose her again in every lifetime, in every world, without hesitation or regret. Eliza read the letter with tears blurring the words, and when she finished, she looked at the man who had shared her life for 40 years. His hair was white now, his face lined with the map of their years together, but his gray eyes held the same depth and tenderness they had held on that first day at the train station. She cupped his weathered face in her hands and kissed him softly, a kiss that carried 4 decades of gratitude and joy and deep abiding love. And in the silence of that prairie meadow, surrounded by wild roses and summer warmth, she finally understood the truth she had been learning all along. The loudest love speaks without words. It speaks through sacrifice and service, through patience and presence, through the 1,000 small acts of devotion that make up a lifetime together. Samuel had never needed a voice to love her. He had loved her with his hands and his heart and every fiber of his being. He had loved her louder than words ever could, and she would carry that love with her beyond the end of her days, a flame that no silence could ever extinguish.